What if I told you that one of rock's most innovative bands spent more time breaking up than making music? A teenage prodigy who had already conquered the charts before he could vote. A countryside cottage where Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, and Pete Townshend made the pilgrimage just to listen. Songs that rewrote the rules of radio, but a band that couldn't survive its own genius. This is the rise and fall of Traffic. By 1967, Steve Winwood had already done the impossible. At 14, he joined the Spencer Davis Group and became the driving force behind hits like Keep On Running and Gimme Some Lovin'. He sang with the gravel and soul of a man twice his age. By 19, he was a millionaire with a reputation that dwarfed most artists twice his experience. But instead of chasing more pop hits, Winwood made a choice that surprised almost everyone. He walked away. He was done with the hit machine. Done with the tightly controlled pop format that prioritized commerce over creativity. What he wanted was something wilder, freer, more honest. And the place he found it was in a cramped cottage at Sheepcote Farm, out in the countryside, on the old Berkshire-Oxfordshire border, where they had to haul in a generator just to power their amplifiers and draw water from a rumored-to-be-haunted well. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Winwood gathered 3 musicians who shared that restless hunger. Jim Capaldi was a drummer and lyricist with a poet's heart, a man who gave the band its name and much of its philosophical direction. Chris Wood was a formally trained multi-instrumentalist who wove flute and saxophone into rock in a way most listeners had never heard before. And Dave Mason was a guitarist and songwriter with a commercial instinct and an outsized personality that would prove both indispensable and explosive. Together, the 4 of them signed with a record label and retreated to Sheepcote Farm, a cottage so remote and primitive that they had to haul a generator just to power their amplifiers and draw water from a rumored-to-be-haunted well. Winwood later described it as 4 students living on top of one another, surrounded by unmade beds, unwashed dishes, and an unbroken stream of creativity. The isolation was intentional. They jammed at any hour. They wrote without deadlines or commercial pressure. They explored blues, jazz, folk, and psychedelia as if every combination was a new discovery. And the music world took notice. High-profile visitors made the pilgrimage to that cottage in the Berkshire Downs. Eric Clapton, Pete Townshend, and Jimi Hendrix among them, drawn by word of a band doing something nobody else could quite name. That cottage, and everything it represented, became the emotional foundation of Traffic. It was proof that 4 young musicians could create their own world entirely on their own terms. But it also planted the seeds of a tension that would follow them for the rest of their career. Traffic arrived on the public stage in the spring of 1967 with perfect timing. The summer of love was building toward its peak, and British radio was hungry for something adventurous. Their debut single, Paper Sun, hit number 5 on the UK charts and announced their arrival with a sitar riff that felt entirely out of place on a rock record, and entirely right. The story behind Paper Sun was pure Traffic folklore. Jim Capaldi spotted a newspaper headline at 3:30 in the morning while staying in a boarding house. He woke Winwood immediately, and the 2 of them finished the song on an upright piano in the living room before dawn. That kind of spontaneous, sleep-defying creativity, the refusal to wait, to plan, to engineer, was what made Traffic so magnetic and so difficult to contain. Their follow-up, Hole in My Shoe, pushed even higher, reaching number 2 in the UK. The song was written and sung by Dave Mason, and it captured the hazy, dreamlike quality of 1967 with a spoken-word bridge delivered by a young girl describing an albatross. It was trippy, whimsical, and utterly of its moment. But within the band, it created a problem. Winwood, Capaldi, and Wood viewed it as too silly and poppy, a commercial distraction from what Traffic was supposed to be. Their most successful single made 3/4 of the band uncomfortable. That paradox would define them for years. Their debut album, Mr. Fantasy, arrived in December 1967 and showed what the band could accomplish when left entirely to their own devices. Produced by Jimmy Miller, who would go on to helm some of the Rolling Stones' greatest work, the album moved fluidly between whimsical pop, blues rock jamming, and pastoral folk. The title track, Dear Mr. Fantasy became a staple of FM radio for the next decade and beyond. A song that felt like a late-night invitation to somewhere you'd never been, but somehow already knew. There was even talk of Traffic being involved with the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour project in some capacity. Such was their standing in the British rock hierarchy. For a band that had only existed for a matter of months, they had already become one of the most compelling stories in rock. Even as the accolades rolled in, the fault lines inside Traffic were widening fast. The core tension was simple on the surface, but impossible to resolve. Dave Mason wrote structured, melodic, pop-influenced songs. Winwood, Capaldi, and Wood wanted to jam, to improvise, to follow the music wherever it led without the constraints of a commercial hook. Both visions produced brilliant music, but they couldn't coexist inside the same band. Mason departed for the first time in January 1968, just weeks after Mr. Fantasy hit shelves. He cited a sense of being overwhelmed and a lack of personal connection with Winwood. The remaining trio pushed forward, doubling down on their experimental tendencies and heading out on a US tour with Winwood, handling both guitar and organ. But the pull of that original chemistry proved too strong to ignore. A chance encounter in New York in mid-1968 brought Mason back into the fold.
I left here on my own, a sun seems.
The reunion produced some of their most enduring material. Mason's Feelin' Alright became one of the most covered songs of the era, Joe Cocker's version, transforming it into a soul anthem heard around the world. The Winwood-Capaldi collaboration, 40,000 Headmen, showcased a more lyrical, poetic side of the band that felt genuinely timeless. Yet the old tensions remained beneath the surface, quietly festering. The label kept selecting Mason's tracks as singles. The resentment inside the band continued to build. And then, in late 1968, Winwood reached his limit. Mason was summoned to a meeting and handed a verdict as blunt as anything in rock history. Winwood reportedly told him something brutally direct, along the lines of, "I don't like the way you write, I don't like the way you sing, I don't like the way you play, and we don't want you in the band anymore." Mason believed the firing was rooted in jealousy over his songwriting success. The trio believed it was necessary to protect what Traffic actually was. Rolling Stone magazine captured the band's predicament perfectly, describing them as plagued with a severe case of loose-endism, unable to maintain stability despite producing music of excruciatingly good quality. Shortly after Mason's second departure, Traffic dissolved entirely. Winwood left to join Blind Faith with Eric Clapton, and the first chapter of Traffic's story came to a sudden, unresolved close. When Blind Faith collapsed after just one album, Winwood found himself adrift. He began recording alone, overdubbing every instrument himself on a solo project that was never quite finished. But something was wrong. The music felt, in his own words, weird and inhuman. He needed other people to make it come alive. He needed his old bandmates. The phone calls to Capaldi and Wood turned a solo album into a Traffic reunion, and produced what many still consider the finest work of their career. John Barleycorn Must Die, released in 1970, was a revelation. Gone was the whimsy of the Mason era. In its place was a sophisticated, deeply felt blend of jazz, blues, and folk that felt like the work of musicians who had finally found exactly what they were looking for. The album peaked at number 5 on the US Billboard charts and was certified gold. Confirmation that Traffic had successfully transformed from a British psychedelic singles act into a fully realized album rock powerhouse for the new decade. The opening instrumental Glad hit with the force of a declaration. The title track, a restrained interpretation of a centuries-old English folk legend, showed a band capable of genuine emotional depth and uncommon restraint. The momentum carried directly into the low spark of High-Heeled Boys in 1971. The album's title came from a note that American actor Michael J. Pollard had written in Jim Capaldi's notebook during a trip to Morocco. Capaldi felt it captured the rebel attitude of their generation, and the music matched every bit of that ambition. The title track stretched to 11 minutes and 41 seconds, built around a hypnotic 5/4 time signature that pulled the listener in like a slow tide and refused to let go. It peaked at number 7 in the United States. The band further expanded their sonic range by recruiting Muscle Shoals, rhythm section legends David Hood on bass and Roger Hawkins on drums, adding a southern R&B grit to their English folk jazz foundation. The 1973 album, Shoot Out at the Fantasy Factory, recorded in Jamaica, found Winwood's guitar work stepping forward in ways audiences had never quite heard before. Raw, exploratory, and fully liberated from the role of accompaniment. For the listeners who discovered these records, this was the golden age of Traffic. Albums that demanded to be heard all the way through. Music that rewarded patience and attention in a way that few rock records ever had. But the machine that had produced all of the brilliance was running down. By the time Traffic hit the road in support of Shoot Out at the Fantasy Factory in 1973, the original communal spirit of Sheepcote Farm felt like a memory from another lifetime. Jim Capaldi had begun pursuing a solo career. The lineup rotated through session musicians who brought technical skill, but none of the intuitive chemistry that had made Traffic special. And at the center of it all, Chris Wood was struggling. Wood had always been the quiet, emotional heart of the band, the man whose flute and saxophone gave Traffic its most distinctive textures. But by the early 1970s, his battles with alcohol and drug addiction had become severe. Those who traveled with the band during this period recalled Wood as totally out of it on stage, wandering without purpose, the musical precision that had defined him becoming increasingly difficult to access. The final studio album of this era, When the Eagle Flies, was released in 1974. It reached number 9 in the United States and achieved gold status by November of that year. Their commercial standing remained intact, even as everything else frayed around it. But the recording sessions carried a somber weight the sales figures couldn't disguise. Wood had composed a track called Moonchild Vulcan that was ultimately left off the album. The loss of that contribution, like so many small defeats during this period, spoke to something larger and harder to name. In the middle of their 1974 US tour, Traffic effectively stopped. Not at the end of a scheduled run, not after a final statement show. They called it a day with dates still on the books. Winwood, who had been carrying the Traffic name since his teenage years, felt the weight of it in a way he could no longer sustain. The band that had begun as an escape from the pressures of the pop industry had itself become a pressure, one he no longer had the energy or the desire to carry. It was the same instinct that had driven him out of the Spencer Davis Group years earlier, the need to move, to change, to find the next thing. Only this time, there was no cottage in the countryside waiting. There was only the road behind them and the silence ahead. The years following Traffic's second collapse were marked by diverging paths and deepening loss. Winwood embarked on a solo career that eventually led to genuine 1980s superstardom. Higher Love and Back in the High Life Again made him one of the decade's biggest names, his voice now carrying the shine of hard-won experience rather than teenage prodigy energy. Capaldi found solo success as well, particularly in the UK, maintaining his songwriting partnership with Winwood on a sporadic but meaningful basis. But the decade carried tragedy alongside its successes. Chris Wood died on July 12, 1983, from liver disease and pneumonia. He was 39 years old, the man who had brought the flute into rock and roll, who had given Traffic its most haunting and beautiful textures, was gone. His unfinished solo album, Vulcan, stood as the unresolved final statement of a talent that the industry and the rock and roll lifestyle had consumed too soon. Winwood and Capaldi eventually reunited in 1994 to record the album Far From Home, which was dedicated to Wood. The cover featured a stick figure playing a flute, a small, quiet tribute to the man who had been at the heart of everything. The reunion tour that followed brought Traffic back to American stages for a significant run of dates opening for the Grateful Dead, including a legendary and much celebrated guest appearance by Jerry Garcia on Dear Mr. Fantasy. For the fans who had followed this band across 2 turbulent decades, that moment, those 2 giants of improvisation sharing a stage, felt like a benediction that nobody had dared to hope for. The final public chapter came in 2004 when Traffic was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. According to people around the band, tensions even surfaced during rehearsals, with disagreements over who would play which instrument. A reminder that the psychic wounds from that late 1968 split were still alive more than 3 decades later. What Traffic left behind was larger than their discography and longer lasting than any of their touring runs. They were pioneers of the alternative band concept before that phrase existed, a collective that refused to define itself by genre, by single-driven commercial logic, or by the personality of one dominant star. At a moment when rock was sorting itself into recognizable categories, Traffic stood deliberately outside all of them. Their influence runs through the whole idea of the jam-oriented rock band. The Grateful Dead, and later bands like Phish and Widespread Panic, share a lot of the same instincts Traffic embraced. Long improvisations, fluid set lists, and treating live shows as works in progress rather than a fixed script. The extended workouts of Dear Mr. Fantasy and The Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys were blueprints for a generation of musicians who believed that the journey mattered more than the destination. Progressive rock owes them a real debt as well. The introduction of woodwind instruments, Wood's flute and saxophone woven through rock arrangements, opened doors that bands like Jethro Tull and Genesis walked straight through. The use of folk elements, jazz improvisation, and classical textures within a rock framework was Traffic's signature move, and it expanded what rock music believed it was allowed to be. They didn't just push boundaries, they quietly dissolved them. Today their records are rediscovered by each new generation of listeners, drawn to vinyl's warmth and the particular atmosphere of music made without safety nets. The Sheepcoat Farm Cottage still permeates those early tracks, the rawness of a band finding itself in real time, committing everything to tape with no guarantee of who would be listening. Dear Mr. Fantasy still sounds like the first night of something important. The Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys still sounds like the last. Traffic was a band that couldn't stay together, but the music they made during those brief burning moments when they were united remains some of the most adventurous, emotionally resonant rock ever recorded. A handful of albums, a dozen years, a body of work that still sounds alive and unfinished, still reaching for something just beyond the edge of what's known. The question isn't why they kept breaking apart. The question is how they ever managed to hold it together long enough to give us what they did. Traffic proved that greatness doesn't require stability, but it helps. They gave their audience some of the most adventurous music of the entire rock era, then took it away again and again. Steve Winwood's voice, Chris Wood's flute, the ghost of a cottage out in the English countryside, all of it still echoes. Do you think Traffic could have been the greatest band of the 70s if they had just managed to stay together? Drop your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into rock's most compelling stories.